ideas that Lynn introduced yesterday. One of the main reasons why the American population seems to be in the state it is today is that it seems to have lost the capacity to debate real issues in a literate way. If you were to ask, and Lynn addressed this yesterday with the question of Hamlet, if you were to ask the average American, present company excluded of course, what the great drama of the day is, that average American might be bewildered and say, well, since the O.J. Simpson trial has gone, there's not very much drama around. But we have high hopes that something might come up in the grand jury with Hillary. The American population, and this is a tragedy, has lost its capacity to thrash out ideas in the form in which literate language makes it possible. Now, this was not always so. As we will see in the presentations in the panel in the afternoon, I'm sure, discussing the real background of the American Revolution and the building of the Republic, we will see that those people who founded this republic were not a bunch of illiterate backwoodsmen who came here to develop the frontier. These were philosophers who built this nation. These were literate people. The population of the early colonies and of the early republic was indeed the most literate in the world of the day. If you read the works of Tom Paine, one of the compatriots of the revolution and the constitutional process here, and you see his account of how the Constitution was discussed in this country, it's absolutely mind-boggling, because he describes how, from the Constitutional Convention, ideas, drafts, proposals for the Constitution would be sent out into the population, into the different states, discussed, debated in town meetings, in homes, in farms. Ideas would be added, contributed, criticism would be made, and this process would go back into the central discussion in Philadelphia and elsewhere. This was a population which had been raised on those great works of literature in the English language. This was a population that had been brought up on Shakespeare, on Marlowe, a profoundly religious Christian population, whose mind was imbued with the ideas and the language of the great King James Version of the Bible. What that population had, and which the population today has lost, but not irrevocably, was what Dante Alighieri would call a volgare illustre, an illustrious vernacular. That is, the native tongue, the vernacular, the mother tongue of a people, elevated through great poetry, great drama, great literature, to become a vehicle for communicating what Shelley would call impassioned ideas concerning man and the universe. America indeed has lost this, and is part of our commitment to revive it. Now, I want to take the example of Dante to show exactly what goes into, or to show some aspects of what goes into developing a literate language. First of all, who was Dante Alighieri? He was a man who, at the end of the 13th century, a political figure, literary figure, somebody who had assimilated universal history up to that point, realized that the civilization that he lived in was doomed. He realized, and he was right, only a half a century later, Europe was to go into the greatest collapse that it had experienced up until that time, with the collapse of the banking system through the Venetian banks and the collapse of civilization, which led to the spread of deadly diseases, epidemics, the Black Plague, which wiped out half of the population of Europe. Dante knew, although he could not foresee the form in which this collapse would come, he knew that the collapse was coming because he saw the corruption, the rottenness, the betrayal, the treachery, the stupidity, the ignorance of the population around him and of the leadership of political institutions. What did Dante do? He was exiled, naturally. He was an oddball who therefore was completely excluded, ostracized from polite society. What could he do? He couldn't intervene politically. He called himself the party of one, il partito di uno, because he was alone. What he decided to do was to write a poem which would establish a national language and develop certain very fundamental, very important ideas, which would then lay the seeds for the future regeneration of a culture in a country whose civilization he saw was doomed. What his aim was in writing this great work, the Commedia, and developing the linguistic, poetical means to do it, his aim was to change the way in which people thought, to change the axioms of the Italians, and to create the basis for a national identity by creating a true national language. Now, Dante elaborated a general theory of the language and of poetry, which was to become the foundation not only for the Italian language, but by extension for all national languages. In his work, De Volgari Eloquentia, which is on the eloquence of the vernacular, the mother tongue, Dante surveyed the Italian landscape at the time, and which was made up of thousands of petty fiefdoms, thousands of little groups of nobles who were jealously guarding their particular turf, their particular power. There were about 30,000 different dialects of what you could call Italian. Not only did every city have its dialect, but as Dante points out, the Bolognese, the people of Bologna, of one neighborhood, Borgo di San Felice, spoke a slightly different dialect than the Bolognese who lived on the main street in the city, and they were proud of it. Not only were these many, but most of them were very ugly. In judging each dialect, which Dante knew intimately, he used musical criteria in order to see which were better and which were worse. He sought out the most harmonious. He said first, since the Romans, the inhabitants of the city of Rome, consider themselves first in everything, we will consider them first in execration, the language, and say that the vernacular spoken by the Romans, or better, their sad language, questo triste parlare, is the ugliest of all the vernaculars. Of course, Dante had not been to the Bronx, he had not been to Dallas, Texas, so that was his frame of reference. But he adds, no wonder the Romans speak such an ugly language, since their habits and their customs stink. The Milanese, the Bergamaschi, he discards as grating to the ear. The Sardinians do not even merit to be considered as a dialect, because what they speak, he says, is no proper vernacular. It's rather a bastardized imitation of Latin, which is an artificial language, Dante knew. The Genoese, he said, would be totally mute if one were to force them not to use the sound z, because they put it in every word. Having gone through the gamut of these dialects, Dante asks himself, just as all numbers numerically, just as all numbers, multiplicity, must be measured in reference to unity, the one, there must be a vernacular which appears in every city but rests in no single one. In other words, he was asking himself the question, what is the one which corresponds to the many of these dialects? The one did not exist in its manifest form, so Dante had to create it, applying the harmonic criteria of music. Thus, he identified the 5 pure vowel sounds, primary in the Italian language, actually in all languages. A, E, I, O, U. As opposed to, for example, the U from the Turinese dialect, la luna, they say, instead of luna. Or the Milanese say Milanese instead of Milanese. And then he considered the beauty of the words according to the purity of their sound. Can we have the first transparency, please? The most beautiful words, which Dante calls combed with a comb, not disheveled, are those of 3 syllables, the ones on the bottom, without harsh sounds, without double consonants. Words like amore, donna, disio, virtute, donare, letizia, salute, securitate, difesa. These are words that are not only correspond to the formal criteria, but also, from the standpoint of their content, are noble words. We're talking here about love, woman, desire, virtue, giving, happiness, health, security, defense. Concepts that are proper to the moral persons and a moral ordering of society. Other kinds of words, which Dante called hirsute, hairy, are monosyllabic words, but necessary. And he also had a category of decorative words, ornate words, of many, many syllables, including very harsh sounds and double consonants. Some of them you see above. Terra, terra. Honore, the H was aspirated. Speranza, gravitate, alleviato, impossibilitate, benaventuratissimo, avventuratissimamente, disavventuratissimamente, sovra magnificentissimamente. Which last word, Dante points out, is a word of 11 syllables, a hendecasyllable. And that, he says, is the maximum length for a word in the Italian language. For reasons you can appreciate after hearing me struggle to say it. But we'll get to the real reason why. Dante did not take all of these words and make rules and compile a dictionary, as, for example, Dr. Samuel Johnson in 18th century England would have done or did do. It was not the formal question of communication. It was not the formal question of conjugation, syntax, or rules. But it was the question of shaping a medium capable of communicating creative scientific ideas. Dante forged this vehicle on the basis of the harmonic criteria, which we will see, in order to create the language of science, which is called poetry. He elaborated the science of composition of poetry, and therefore music, which derives from poetry, not only for the Italian language, but implicitly for all languages. Now, Dante understood that the vehicle for communicating a creative idea is a metaphor. Next transparency, please. What do we mean by a metaphor? Using an example which Lynn has developed and used many times, look at this little drawing. You see that what we have here is a circle in the top left with an inscribed and actually circumscribed square. The square, the polygon inside as well as outside in this case, but inside the circle is continually divided up so that each side is divided, the number of sides becomes multiplied. The idea behind this process is to try to bring the polygon into coherence with the circle, to square the circle. As you see, however, the more successful we are in this process, actually the farther away from our aim we come. In the microscopic view that you have in the lower right, you'll see that what happens in continuing this process of multiplication to come closer asymptotically to the circle, what happens is that you are multiplying the number of singularities, the number of angles, which is the characteristic of the polygon. Whereas the circle is characterized by the fact, among other things, it has no angles. So the more successful you are, the closer you come, the farther away you are, which proves that the circle is of an other and superior characteristic regarding, as compared to the polygon. Now, having gone through this, thank you, you can put a name to this and call it squaring the circle, or the attempted proof of squaring the circle. In other words, a metaphor is a name that you give to a discovery, a scientific discovery, which after having gone through the process of replicating that discovery or making it originally for the first time, a name is attached to, and that name then becomes a referent for the process we have just gone through. This is what poetry does. Now, Dante saw, next please, in the form of the strophic poem, the key to all composition. And he called it the canzone. Canzone from the verb cantare, to sing. Canzone is song. As Lynn has written, the tradition of vocalization of classical strophic poetry is the probable origin of what we know as scientific thought and scientific method today. This is something that Dante understood, intuited. He understood that strophic poetry held the key to the transmission of certain specific ideas, scientific ideas. Now, how he talks about the canzone is in the following terms. What is the canzone, he says? Well, it's the action or passion of singing, the action of him who creates it, the composer, and the passion on the part of him who recites or sings it. The canzone, furthermore, is very different from and superior to other poetical forms, like the ballad or the sonnet, because the canzone is made up of harmonized words, harmonically composed and combined words, which are apt to be sung. In other words, it has the musicality in itself and requires no musical accompaniment, as did the ballad and the sonnet. Now, what is the form of the canzone? He says it's a conjugation, like you'd usually use to describe a verb, a conjugation of stanzas, which tend toward a statement, a single idea, a concept. The key in the canzone is the stanza, which he calls the heart of the canzone. The art, all of the art of the canzone is contained in the stanza. Now, what is the stanza? Stanza, by the way, means room. Like this is a room, a large, this is stanzone, big room. But stanza means a room. The stanza is formally a number of poetical lines which may be divided according to length of syllables, for example, 11 syllables, 7 syllables, 9 syllables, and so on, and organized in groups. For example, this is a schematic rendering of what Dante calls a typical stanza. You would have 4 lines at the beginning, say all 11 syllables, rhyming A, B, B, C. That he calls a foot. The same scheme is repeated, the same length of lines, A, B, B, C, that's another foot. So if you have a division, these are called feet. Then you have a long part, which has a different rhyme scheme, C, D, E, E, D, F, D, F, G, G, which is the coda, the tail. Note that going from the second foot to the coda, you have a rhyming line, C and C, which Dante calls the diesis. Now he says, each stanza, this is one stanza, and that stanza form would then be repeated many times in the course of a canzone. Each stanza is harmonized to receive a certain oda, a certain musical idea, which is reflected in the rhyme, or song. Sometimes, he says, the stanza will continue according to one musical idea to the end, without repetition or division. Here we have repetition and division. We call division, he says, that which moves one musical idea to another. This is called volta, turn, or diesis, which is the sharp sign, as in music, to modulate from one key to the next. And that's what we saw in that line, rhyme CC. Next, please. Here you see an example of the stanza harmonized to receive a certain oda, or song, which continues. You can barely see it, but if you look at the end rhyme, you'll see that the words are ombra colli erbo verde petra donna, and then in the next part, donna ombra petra colli verde erba, then erba donne verde ombra colli petra, petra erba colli donna, and so on. Very difficult to write a meaningful poem respecting these kinds of limitations. But this is an example of a canzone which does not change. Next. An example of a canzone where you do have the change. This is Donne che avete intelletto d'amore, a canzone which is addressed to ladies, those of you who have the intellect of love. Now, keep this on, please. Dante will show that the stanza is not just a formal consideration. It's not an arbitrary form. where you say, I'll have 5 lines here or 4 lines there, I'll rhyme or not rhyme. The stanza is what it is because it represents a form in which an idea can be put through its development, regardless of the number of lines it may have, because there's a great flexibility in the form. But the basic idea, as Lynn has referenced, talking about the sonata form, the basic idea in developing the canzone is to have a statement, a restatement or counterstatement, a development form, and a recapitulation, which is the form in which human creative thought appears. If you look at this particular canzone, which Dante writes in his Vita Nuova, which is his earliest work in which he's developing this form and writing canzoni and then explaining what they are. So it's very useful work to study how he elaborated this form. You find that here you have 5 stanzas. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All of the same form if you look at it internally. Dante says, I've divided this stanza into 3 main parts. The first part, 1, which is stanza 1, which presents the basic idea of my entire poem, which is the prelude, the announcement of the idea. Then in stanzas 2, 3, 4, which I've marked as 2, I elaborate this idea and actually say in these 3 stanzas what I say at the beginning I'm going to say. And then in the last, which is marked 3, he says, I recapitulate and summarize the development of the whole. Not only here in the canzone form as a whole, but actually within the single stanza, Dante shows that this organization of poetic lines and rhymes corresponds also to the process of a developing thought. He says, take the first stanza. You see on the right, I've marked off 1, 2, 3, 4. These are his divisions. He says, in the very first part, these first 4 lines, I say to who I want to speak about my lady, Beatrice, and why. Then in 2, I say how I feel when I contemplate her virtue, and how I know that if I could express it appropriately, I would make my hearer immediately fall in love. Then, in part 3, he says, now here I say what I'm going to be saying about her. And then finally, 4, I say again to whom I'm speaking and why. He's speaking here to these donne donzelle, who have an intellect of love, because this is a matter, what he's going to develop, which not everybody should hear about or talk about. Right? It's not fit for everybody's ears or mind, but only to such persons. So here again you have the statement, the second statement or restatement, the elaboration and the recapitulation. Each stanza has its musical idea, as we've seen, bounded by the syllabic lines. The form is continued, maintained, but the content, of course, changes, develops. It remains in the memory upon which is impressed the form, the musicality of the stanza, and it carries the meaning through the metaphor forward. As Lynn writes in his recent work on harps, the strophe provides a repeated yet varied structure for the poem as a whole. The change of vowels and consonants, in contrast of one strophe to each of the others, provides a degree of contrapunctal irony to the repeated common aspect of the successive strophes. The imagery of ideas in the verse as such provides another degree of contrapunctal irony. It is the juxtaposition of these ironies which generates paradoxes. The form known as the classical strophic poem provides the poet thus a medium whose potential is a nest of paradoxes within the stanza, among the stanzas, and in the poem taken as a unit whole. Now, this may come as a shock to you, but Dante did not invent the stanza. He did not invent the canzone. It's important to note here, particularly since we're talking about universal history and the contribution of various cultures to what we understand as universal history, to realize that the stanza, the strophic poem, first of all, is a very ancient form, a form that was found already thousands of years ago in the Vedic poems, Sanskrit. It's abundant in the Greek poetry of the classical period. But in the modern era, the strophic poem re-entered and began to shape modern vernaculars through Dante, through Arabic, not first through Italian. Now, the Arabic tradition, which Helga also referenced earlier in talking about Charlemagne, the Arabic tradition of poetry, which gave a tremendous impulse to the development of the vernaculars in Europe, was particularly the Arab culture in Spain, Islamic Spain, known as Al-Andalus, Andalusia. This was a culture colonized by, the land colonized by the Arabs after 711, when they invaded Spain, which grew, at least under those humanist leaders, which the culture had for many centuries, grew to be a flourishing culture, a flourishing society in agriculture, manufactures, trade, a society which was urban-based with hundreds of cities and with millions of people, 30 million people in the area which was Andalusia, which is not even all of Spain today. It was a culture which had great cities like Cordoba, the capital, Sevilla, the center of musical instrument production, Toledo, the center of translations, and so on and so forth. The key to the success, the relative success of Andalusian civilization in Spain was the role that language played in Arab culture, and particularly the role of poetry. Now, this derives from a very particular characteristic of Islam, which is the importance laid on the spoken word. In the Revelation, the book known as the Quran, what are the first words which the prophet hears from God? The first command he's given is Ikra. Correct me if I'm pronouncing it wrong. The first command he's given is read, recite. And this is a revolutionary command because the prophet, Muhammad, is an illiterate. So this means that the revelation of the Word of God, according to Muslims, is presented in the form of the gift of language again to man. As a result of the fact that the holy book of Islam is in Arabic, that means that every Muslim, in order to be a religious Muslim, to pray, must know the language Arabic. And he must know correct Arabic, the Arabic of the Quran, which is poetical Arabic. Furthermore, in Islam, in the Quran, it is said that one of the many ways of worshiping the Lord is to develop one's mind, to learn, to acquire wisdom, and to spread it. Therefore, the culture, at least under those enlightened leaders which were there, the culture placed a significant emphasis on education. There were educational institutions in Andalusia which did not exist at the time in other parts of Europe. In addition to the mosques, which were traditionally like schools, there was the kutab, the elementary school, where basic skills, reading, writing, arithmetic, and so on, were learned, where memorization was stressed. There were schools that were set up informally in the homes of learned men. In the 9th and 10th centuries, the mosques developed into bona fide universities, with scholars from Judaism, from Islam, from Christianity, thronging to these universities to teach. There were academies as well, the Dur al-Hikmah, Dur al-Ilm, the house of wisdom, the house of knowledge. And then, at one period at least, under Hakem II in the 10th century, probably the greatest leader of Andalusia, there were state-sponsored schools from the 10th and lasted into the 11th century, schools called madrasa. Hakem II himself was a great scholar. He had a library with 400,000 volumes. He sent people out throughout the civilized world in search of great books in any language, to bring them back, to have them translated, to make them available to others. And it is said that Hakem II read every one of these books because he annotated in the margins. Hakan II was the first to introduce free elementary schools for children, for those who did not have money to go to other schools. And he set up 27 such elementary schools in Cordoba. Now, this obviously describes a society which is relatively advanced, at least in literacy, to the society in the rest of Europe. As we heard again today, Charlemagne, a great leader of Northern Europe, was, however, not able to read or write. So this emphasis on the written word, the emphasis on the power of language, which comes directly from the religious worldview as embodied in the Quran, was crucial to developing the society of Andalusia. Ironically, this same society did not succeed in developing a nation state, did not succeed in elaborating those institutions which would create a nation around this language culture, for reasons we may discuss in the question and answer period. But what I want to stress here is the special role of the language. Since also the language of the Quran, classical Arabic, was taken to be the language of revelation, it was necessary to make sure that new converts to the religion would speak the language properly. That meant that philological schools grew up, for example, in Basra, in Kufa, in today's Iraq. Already in the 8th century, 7th and 8th century, there were these schools of philology which did more or less what Panini had done for Sanskrit for the Arabic language, codified the language and elaborated the rules of word formation and so on, in order to make sure that the language would not be in any way, would not degenerate. Now, the role of poetry in Andalusia was something absolutely unique. It's described in the following terms. Poetry was not something for poets. Poetry was for everybody. Poetry was a means of expression, of communication. Not only were statesmen cited for their poetical production, but every peasant was obsessed by the gift of improvisation. And even the farmer behind the plow would make verses about any subject whatsoever. Chronicles report that poetry was an indispensable tool for every aspect of social and political life. Poems that wound around the columns and walls as decoration constituted a major decoration in all the palaces and even in the government chancelleries. The art of poetry played a role. Men from the humblest position rose to the highest, honored positions, to royal consideration even, solely through their poetical talent. Verses gave the signal for bloody combat and disarmed as well the rage of the victor. Poetry had to lay its weight in the balance in order to lend more energy to diplomatic negotiations. A leading figure would send a poet as his ambassador to negotiate with someone. And a happy improvisation often broke open the jail gates for a prisoner or saved the life of one condemned to death. Now, what kind of poetry was it that was sung by the population in Andalusia? Next, please. It was a strophic poem, the predecessor to the canzone. Strophic poem known as a muwashsha, muwashshahat in the plural. And you see here, this is a transliteration of the Arabic, which I will not try to read, but just note the organization of this. This is the little first stanza. You find two lines which rhyme, ahdar, tahdar, tazhar, which are the opening two lines. Then you find three lines, jamalu, dijalu, simalu, which rhyme in another way. And then a final line, yanahwar, which rhymes with the first. So what you have here, and these are the names in Arabic for these parts of the stanza. The first two lines are called markaz. This next group is called guzn, and the last simt, which rhymes with the first. So this was the form which was used for these poetry. And it's important to see that this was not something that was in the history of Arabic. Classical Arabic poetry had a continuous rhyme without this organization into thought objects, so to speak. This was a revolution, a new introduction into the Arabic language, which occurred in Spain and in Arabia more or less at the same time in the 9th century, and from there spread like wildfire throughout the courts of Europe, through the troubadours, through the Minnesänger, and so on. Next. And you see just some examples in other languages which were emerging as vernaculars in Europe at the time. For example, Spanish, vivo ledo con razón, amigos todos salón, and so on. The same organization of the stanza, and you see the corresponding Spanish names for the Arabic names. Underneath, this next one, Padre beato per tua caritade, and so on. Again, in Italian. Next, please. Here you see more examples in Italian, and the one in the middle, Morte Villana, comes from Dante's Vita Nuova, the new life. So this shows you, and this is exactly a muwasha stanza, the exact same form that you find in the Arabic. Dante shows he knew directly in this poem that begins Morte Villana. Now, what were these poems about? Just to give you a brief example. Most of the poems in Andalusia, in this tradition, were the poems of courtly love. They were poems that praised the qualities of the damsel, of the lady, the beloved. Some of them, however, were ironical, some of them were social critical, polemical, and some of them were epigrammatic. For example, there's one called, this is by Ibn al-Kabaza from the 13th century, The King Who Died Young. Your life was of the order true of Arab eloquence. The tale was brief, the words were few, the meaning was immense. And then just one other. This is called Mutability by Ibn Hazm, who was one of the greatest poets in Andalusia. He lived in the 10th and 11th century. Mutability. Let not my jealous foes exult in my disgrace, for fortune comes and goes, nor tarries in one place. A free man is like gold, now cast for hammering, but presently behold, crown upon a king. Among the religious poets, who were a large number in Andalusia, the mystics in Islam, there was a poetical form that developed which was a form of a dialogue between the believer and God. And the idea behind this poetry was to try to reach oneness, unity with God. This is the poetry that particularly influenced Raymond Lull, Raimundus Lullus, who in fact wrote an entire series of poems based on this model. It's called The Book of the Friend and the Beloved, in which he develops what he calls spiritual metaphors, 365, one for each day of the year. Spiritual metaphors between himself, the friend, and the beloved God. It's a very beautiful collection. Lull was fascinated by this culture. Raimundus Lullus was a Christian, a missionary, somebody who dedicated his entire life to evangelization, to converting Muslims to Christianity. But he understood that in order to take on the task he had carved out for himself, he had to have an understanding of the culture of the people he was talking to. So Lull spent 10 years doing nothing other than studying Arabic with a freed slave who became his teacher. He studied the Arabic language, he studied the philosophy, the philology, the history, all of the literary texts he could find, and of course the religion. And as a result of this immersion in Arab and Islamic culture, Lull shaped his dialogues, ecumenical dialogues, and other works addressing Muslims from a standpoint that no other Christian could quite approximate, because he got inside the mind of the culture, so to speak. The same can be said of Dante. The influence of Islam, the influence of Islamic culture in Spain and also in Sicily, at Friedrich II's court on Dante has been much underestimated. Those who have documented it have been ridiculed because Dantisti in Italy would prefer to think that Dante didn't owe anybody anything outside of Italy. However, it is the case that this culture had a tremendous influence on Dante, and that his response to the culture was similar to Lull's, but I think far greater and far more important in consequence. Dante saw that here was a vibrant culture in Spain based on Islam, a religious belief which he held to be untrue. His commitment was to show the superiority of Christian belief, particularly of the Trinity, which is that which divides Christianity and Islam theologically, to show that in terms which would outstrip the achievements, so to speak, of that same culture. It's significant to see that Dante, in shaping his poem, the Commedia, used a motif which comes out of Islamic literature, the motif of the journey into paradise. This is a motif, as we've seen, going into hell, for example, that goes back to the pre-Christian religions. But the specific motif of a believer going into paradise, Dante received through Brunetto Latini, his teacher, in works that have been translated out of the Arabic, because there is an episode in the Quran that tells of Muhammad the Prophet's ascension to heaven. It's a very brief episode, but on the basis of that episode, an enormous literature developed. There were poems which celebrated this event, and Dante knew a lot of them through Brunetto Latini. So instead of having the prophet go to paradise, Dante chooses as his motif the pilgrim, the believer, the poet, the political protagonist, Dante himself going to paradise. It's a different journey, a different kind of paradise. And this is his response, in a certain sense, I think, to Islam. The Commedia is organized also as a great strophic poem. It's much longer than any of the canzoni, but it's organized in 3 great stanzas, known as canticles. And each one of these stanzas, Inferno, Purgatory, and Paradise, are divided into 33, or in the case of Inferno, 34 canti, songs. So it replicates on a much vaster scale the same kind of organization that you find in the canzone. Have the first slide, please. I want to go very rapidly through this. It takes much longer to get to paradise in reality. But I see by the clock on the wall that we don't have that time to do it, so I'll try to expedite matters. What is the Commedia? Well, here you see a graphical representation of the universe as it's represented in the Commedia. You have the earth, and going from the top down, you see a spiral descent. That's hell. And then coming up off the other side at the bottom, you see a mountain. That's purgatory, which you climb up. And around, you see paradise, the heavens, the solar system, which is paradise. Next. Now, Dante finds himself in hell, as many people do at a certain moment in their lives. He finds himself, as he says, lost in the forest, having lost the true path, and nothing but animals, ferocious beasts, surround him and threaten him. Next. Until he's visited by Virgil, the great poet of Latin literature. Virgil, who tells him, Dante, I have been sent here by Beatrice, by a woman who is in heaven, in paradise, who knows of your plight, and who has sent me here in order to guide you to paradise. Dante, who is immediately overcome by fear, sense of inadequacy, says, why me? I'm not a hero. Overcomes this initial fear through the thought that there's someone who loves him sufficiently to undertake this enterprise. And he decides he has to go along with Virgil, into paradise. And then Virgil tells him, well, of course, the route I didn't explain to you before, but it goes through hell. Dante, again, is a little bit hesitant. But he does indeed faint. But urged on by the loving support of Virgil, he does go through. Next. Now, what is hell? Hell, you see here, the two of them on the verge of the descent into the lower hell, Malabolge, where all the worst criminals are found. Hell is the reign of Hobbesian man. Hell is the place where human nature resides, if you think about how Lynn was developing this concept yesterday. Hell is not a place. Hell is the mind. It's the mind of the irrational individual. The irrational individual who is driven by nothing but lust, fear, greed, hatred, rage, desire. And therefore is a mind incapable of thinking, a mind incapable of contributing anything positive. It is a mind that is fixed in its own categories. And in fact, hell is beautifully organized in Aristotelian categories down to the last detail, which is Dante's comment on Aristotle's philosophical system. So he meets up with sinners who have ended up in hell, who have been imprisoned in the lifetime by these irrational desires, by these irrational passions, who have not been able to overcome them, and who even in hell, in many cases, are condemned to continue acting out this irrational insanity. For example, the blasphemers. He finds the blasphemers, those who swear against God and Christ and so on. One of the blasphemers are condemned to swim, or rather be submerged and try to stay afloat in a lake of excrement, which stinks. And you have one of these blasphemers known to Dante, who when he sees the boat of Dante and Virgil come along, he raises his hand up above the excrement in order to shout out again his ultimate blasphemy. So these are minds which are incapable, which are being condemned to repeat into infinity this fixedness. Now he meets up with the homosexuals who are pelted by a rain of fire. Next. He meets up with the usurers. This is the Chase Manhattan, Citibank, and the IMF. Each one of these are the actual symbols of bankers in Italy in the day. The usurers, by the way, are in the same area as the homosexuals, because they are both guilty of having violated the laws of nature. Next. Dante comes across many people he knows in current day Italy, people who are responsible for the catastrophe that he knows is about to descend on the entire country. And he names them by name as he goes, descending from circle to circle in hell. He'll even name the Pope, Bonifacio, as one who was guilty of simony, of having sold indulgences of the church. Next. And at the very bottom, in the lake of ice, where the sinners are frozen into their position for all eternity, he meets with the traitors like Conte Ugolino and Satan. Next. Now, in every one of these cases in hell, what Dante does, and what you, the reader, do as a result, is to confront this irrationality in the form of the metaphor, the form of the sinner that he sees in front of him, and recognizes in himself, or hears in himself, echoes of that same irrationality. By so doing, by so confronting this, Dante is going through a self-reflection and self-confrontation process, which for Dante is the precondition to knowledge. He has to rid himself of this irrationality, of this fixedness, of tradition, of the good old ways, and free his mind to become creative. In purgatory, the process is completely different. The process is one of ascent, but not heavenly ascent. This is ascent through hard work, This is the ascent through duty. Virgil and Dante go up the mountain of purgatory, plodding away. And Dante many, many times wants to stop because it's so hard, tiring. But at each circle in purgatory, he meets also sinners. However, the difference with these sinners is they are repentant. They are people who have become self-conscious of their sins and therefore are working in order to overcome their state of sin in order to be able to enter paradise. So the emotional attitude that they have is markedly different. The attitude that Dante has to them is markedly different. He is not repelled. He's not shocked. He's not horrified. He's compassionate. And he expiates his own sins through this compassion for the sinners that he meets. Next. And as he goes up circle after circle after circle, the journey becomes lighter and lighter. He is relieved of his sin in the form of the sign peccato on his forehead and is ready to enter paradise. Now, next. What is the precondition for his entering paradise? Well, we don't have the slide here, but he has to go through a wall of fire. And the reason why he has to go through the wall of fire is that he has to overcome this mere adherence to duty, which is characteristic of purgatory, and to bring his emotions into coherence with his ideas. What he knows to be right to do, he must do, not because he's forcing himself to do it, as he has been in purgatory, but because there is an emotional commitment that flows towards this duty. Beatrice is on the other side of the fire. Beatrice, who becomes his guide. Virgil guided him through hell and purgatory, but to enter into paradise, you need a different metaphor. A different kind of relationship is required for this kind of experience. Next. Here he is going into from the surface of the earth to the moon. Next. Here he is on the surface of the moon with Beatrice. And here begins a series of questions, which is the characteristic of paradise. I'll only use one example for time reasons. But Dante in paradise is no longer, he doesn't meet up with the same kinds of individuals he's met up with before. He's confronted with certain phenomena in the physical universe. His mind has become freed of the infantilism, irrationality of hell. He's free now to ask questions about the laws of the universe, and this is what he does. He asks, for example, Beatrice, why are there those dark spots on the moon? Good question. And Beatrice says, well, she doesn't just give him the answer, she says, why? Why do you think there are dark spots on the moon? And Dante says, well, I think probably it's because there are certain areas of the moon that are thicker and certain areas of the moon that are thinner. So that's why they're dark and light. And Beatrice says, well, that's not right, because if that were the case, when there were an eclipse of the moon, then the rays of the sun would shine through those parts which were thinner, more transparent, wouldn't they? Dante says, that's true, isn't it? Well, there must be another reason. Beatrice says, yes, there is. What's the other reason? He says, well, I think probably there are craters on the moon, that there are certain areas of the moon's surface which are dug out, so to speak, and that those are darker because they're farther away from the light, so they don't reflect the light in the same way. And Beatrice says at this point next, well, why don't you try an experiment in order to see if your theory is valid? Take 3 mirrors and place them at a distance. Place 2 of them at a certain distance behind you, and the third much further back. And then place a candle in the front. And look, observe to see what kind of a reflection the candle will cast in the 3 mirrors. You'll find, she says, and they do the experiment, that the size of the candle flame in this mirror that is farthest away will be smaller, yes, because it's farther away, but the intensity will be the same. So that means that your theory about the craters on the surface of the moon is wrong. So Dante says, all right, so you tell me. Why are there dark spots on the moon? And Beatrice goes through an explanation which she will repeat in different forms throughout the journey through paradise, which has nothing to do with the physical, empirical substance of the moon, but has to do with the principle of the creation of the universe. And what she tells him in brief is, the Creator has created the universe as a unity. However, the Creator, in the process of creation, has introduced multiplicity in the unity. He has introduced differentiation in all parts of the physical universe. And just as you, she said, have different members of your body, arms, legs, head, and so on, with different functions, different virtu, capacities, so too everything in the physical universe is differentiated according to its virtu. Therefore, what you see in the dark spots on the moon has nothing to do with the surface of the moon, but it's a reflection of the principle of multiplicity and unity, which is a principle of the creation of the universe. And Dante says, aha, I understand. And in that moment, through that process, he moves up with her to the next celestial body. And this is the process that continues throughout paradise. It's questions and answers. It's Dante asking questions, fundamental questions about the nature of the universe, and struggling through discoveries which already had been made or which he was making at the moment in order to explain the questions that had been unanswered. Every time that Dante makes this kind of breakthrough, Beatrice becomes brighter. She seems to become brighter. Her love expands, and his love for her, in turn, expands. Now, next, it's through this process that they reach the final, go through all the planets, the celestial bodies, and reach the Empyrean, the primum mobile, where all the souls whom Dante has met in his previous travels in paradise, he sees again reunited where they really are, which is in the Empyrean. Now Dante has reached this point, and there's one final question which plagues him, which he asks in the very last canto. And the question that he asks is, he looks at the light which has been increasing as his mind has been developing through this process of scientific discovery. And he wants to know, what is the source of the light? So he looks into the light, which he identifies, as intensely as possible in order to see what the source of the light is. He's looking for God, the source of creation. And what he sees is 3 concentric spheres, looked like a rainbow in a certain sense. He peers more intensely into these 3 concentric spheres, and he says, this is the light, the eternal light. The eternal light which knows itself, which is knowing, and which is the known. I looked into this light, I peered into this light, and what did I see? I saw emerge from it the image of my own face, the image of a human face. And at that moment, the vision is lost. But think about what this is. This is what Lynn has called the metaphor of metaphors in a great poem, This Work. This is the moment, and we have no slide to show it because it's very difficult to depict this in any sensuous form. But this is the moment in which Dante reaches the final vision, which is the understanding of the Trinity. The understanding of the Trinity in this sense, that he has traversed hell, purgatory, and paradise. He has come to the point, through the loving relationship with his teacher Beatrice, that he can make fundamental discoveries about the nature of the physical universe. And in so doing, reflect upon the way in which his mind makes such discoveries, such hypotheses. And in so doing, he realizes that the nature, the process whereby he makes these hypotheses and discoveries is coherent with that very physical universe that he is discovering. Therefore, he understands, as he says in the last canto, the identity of the creator, the created, and the creating, which is the Trinity. Now, Dante's poem, before it was given over to the literary critics, had the most fundamental, profound effect on history of, I think, any poem, any one single poem. This poem shaped the Renaissance. This is a poem which was in the minds of those great scholars and churchmen and humanists who gathered at the Council of Florence. The painting on the wall of the Santa Maria Novella church in Florence, where it took place, was a painting of Dante showing his paradise, purgatory, and hell. The Commedia was a poem that was known to every one of the giants of the Renaissance. It was through this poem, through the process of self-development, which the poem actually generates in the careful reader, that people like Leonardo, Brunelleschi, Raphael, and others became what they became. We know that Leonardo considered the Commedia as his Bible. In fact, it was in the Renaissance that it took on the name Divina. It was divine. It was like the Bible. It was read in the churches. It was recited. It was the basis for education in the home. This was a poem which shaped the identity of an entire population, which was Dante's aim, and provided that population with the most advanced language, poetical vehicle it could desire to develop the nation. Now, what this poem did, as you see in the process of hell, purgatory, and paradise, was to change the mentality of those who truly studied it. It was not a poem that one read and commented on or wrote a dissertation on. It was a poem that one worked through, the way in which literature should work on the minds of human beings. Now, to conclude, I don't need the slide anymore, thank you. I would like to make some comments on what may appear to be another subject, Helen Keller. And that's for the following reason. What you see in the Divina Commedia is the paradigm for the most universal human experience that we know, and that is the process of intellectual development, the process of scientific discovery. Now ask yourself, what is the first fundamental discovery that a child makes? Well, obviously, it's the discovery of language. And as Lynn has pointed out, assimilating a language for a child constitutes one of the greatest scientific discoveries one could imagine. So I want to end with a couple of considerations on just what this process is of learning a language, what is a language, and so forth. First of all, ask yourselves, what is a language? Well, it's given, isn't it? I mean, English exists, doesn't it? And then what language are we talking about? Well, English, of course. I mean, the Bible is in English, right? Christ spoke English. Ted Turner speaks English. Larry King speaks English. Right? Now, who gave us this language if it's given? Well, it must be God. Did he give us only English? Apparently not. I mean, if you've ever been out, if you have at least a satellite disc on your TV that will give you Canadian TV, you know that English is not the only language that exists, but that there are other languages. And we know indeed that the oldest human invention, human language, is in fact thousands and thousands of years old. We have the first records from the Vedic hymns, which were transmitted for centuries orally before they were written down. But since then, and in the intervening period, there have been literally thousands of human languages developed, all of them different, but all of them essentially coherent, all of them translatable from one into the other. Now, language is a necessary product, a necessary creation of man. Why? Well, as Dante says very clearly in his De Vulgari Eloquentia, he says, you know, angels don't have any problem communicating one with another. because they are ethereal beings. They're purely spiritual, and therefore they can just think a thought and it will be communicated to the other. We human beings are not only spiritual, but we are also sensual. We have soul and body. Therefore, we need some sensuous means in order to communicate that which is in my mind into your mind. And that's why God gave man, and only man, the capacity for language. He says God would have given language to animals, but the problem with animals is among their species, they always fight with each other, so if you gave them language, you'd have a terrible situation. Now, as Humboldt says, Wilhelm von Humboldt, each language develops its own means, its own particular means, in a very ingenious way, to communicate these human thoughts from one mind to another. And it does this through the articulation of a system of sounds, which are ordered in such a way that the sounds among themselves, and Leibniz had already pointed this out, have a certain relationship which reflects the relationship among processes in the physical universe. Now we ask ourselves, how is it that objects take on names? Well, if you go to Locke or Hume or Berkeley or any of these other people, they will tell you one of two things. They say, for example, why is this called a book? Well, there's two possibilities. One is that the name book is inherent. You sort of feel it like a Ouija board and book comes out, you know. That everything has a name inherently. Or that it could very well be called bicycle, but that out of human convention it was decided that it be called book. In other words, Adam and Eve got together at one point and Adam said, "What is that you have in your hand, Eve?" And she said, "Well, let's call it an apple." And he said, "Okay." So it's through convention that some of these things got names, they say. Well, how do you learn these names? If you look at Locke, Locke will say that the mind is a tabula rasa. The mind is an empty space, an empty blackboard. The souls of the newly born are empty tablets, and only afterwards filled in by observation and reasoning. So what you have to have first is sensations in the form of things that you see or hear or whatever, in order to have perceptions, and then these perceptions inside your mind, which is an empty space that receives all these impressions then can be combined, compared, and so on, as to similarity, difference, or whatever, and that is what he calls thought. It's very similar to what you would find in a computer. And he says very clearly, this is Locke in his essays on human understanding. He says, simple ideas, the materials of all our knowledge, are suggested and furnished to the mind only by those two ways above mentioned, sensations, impressions. When the understanding is once stored with these simple ideas, it has the power to repeat, compare, and unite them, even to an almost infinite variety, and can make it pleasure new ideas. But it's not in the power of the most exalted wit or enlarged understanding, by any quickness or variety of thoughts, to invent or frame one new simple idea in the mind, not taken in by the ways before mentioned. So there is no possibility of individual creative thought. There is only the possibility of receiving impressions, juggling them around, and making commutations, permutations, and so on. Now suppose if this were true, if this Lockean notion were true, what do you do about a person who doesn't have the access to those senses? What do you do with a child who is blind and cannot see the book? What do you do with a child who is deaf and cannot hear you say book? A child who also cannot repeat the word book when it hears it. Well, this is the case indeed of Helen Keller, which makes the study of her experience extremely fascinating, because if she could learn language, it proves that everything that Locke, Hume, and the other empiricists say about the human mind is false. Now, Humboldt understood very clearly how the process of language actually works. He says, it's not the subject, the sensation which comes into my mind. He says, subjective activity, that's the subject. Subjective activity fashions an object in thought. For no class of presentations can be regarded as a purely receptive contemplation of a thing already present. The activity of the sense must combine synthetically with the inner action of the mind, and from this combination, the presentation is ejected, becomes an object, vis-a-vis the subjective power, and perceived anew as such, returns back to the latter. In other words, the act of perception is not passive reception, but it occurs with an action of the mind, which in turn becomes the object of reflection. Language, Humboldt says, is indispensable for this. For in that the mental striving breaks out through the lips in language, the product of that striving returns back to the speaker's ear. Thus the presentation becomes transformed into real objectivity, without being deprived of subjectivity on that account. Only language can do that. And without this transformation occurring constantly with the help of language, even in silence, occurring constantly, without this transformation into an objectivity that returns to the subject, the act of concept formation, and with it all true thinking, is impossible. So, he concludes, quite regardless of communication between man and man, speech is a necessary condition for the thinking of the individual in solitary seclusion. So how then does this operation actually occur in the case where the person, Helen Keller, cannot hear, cannot see, and cannot speak, cannot objectify, as he says, the perceived idea. Helen Keller, who was born in 1880 in Alabama, was a normal child until she was 19 months old, at which point she was stricken by a horrible disease, a disease which was an intestinal disease with accompanying fever, and which left her, from one day to the next, blind, deaf, and dumb. She turned into a beast. She was utterly unmanageable. She tyrannized her family, who obviously were helpless as to what to do to help this child. Finally, they found help because they heard about the case of a young woman, Laura Bridgman, who had also been blind, deaf, and dumb, and who had acquired the power of language at the Perkins Institute for the Blind in Boston. So the family, eager to do something to liberate their child from this hell of darkness, found somebody from the Perkins Institute for the Blind who would come and teach their child. Now the question, of course, that emerges at the end of this story, you will see, is who is the more extraordinary individual, Helen Keller, the child, or Anne Sullivan, the teacher? The young woman who was sent to teach this child language was herself almost blind and had, for that reason, been at the Perkins Institute for the Blind. She was the daughter of a drunk Irish immigrant. She had been in the poorhouse. Her brother had died there. She had a terrible family background. But for some reason, she had a will to live, to develop, and she had an uncanny understanding of the workings of the human mind, perhaps through her own experience. She was sent then to the Keller's home, and the child was 6 years old, 6 years and 9 months old. The day that Anne Sullivan came into Helen Keller's life, she remembers as my soul's birthday. Her body's birthday was 6 years before, but her soul was born the day that this woman came. In fact, in later life, Helen Keller wrote a little poem to describe how it was before she had the power of language. And she wrote it in the following way. It was not night, it was not day, but vacancy absorbing space, and fixedness without a place. There was no stars, no earth, no time, no check, no change, no good, no crime. Anne Sullivan entered her life and changed that, brought light and love and wisdom into her life. How did she do it? How do you have access to the mind of a child who is cut off from most sense perceptions. What she did was to begin to spell into the child's hand words like doll, D-O-L-L, not using our alphabet, but using the alphabet used by the deaf, a hand alphabet, however, transcribed into the head. So the child received these impressions in her hand. And she remembers the delight with which she received these impressions. However, she didn't understand anything about what the impressions actually meant. She said, this is Helen Keller herself writing in her autobiography later, she said, I was at once interested in this finger play. It was a wonderful game, and I tried to imitate it. And I did not know that I was spelling a word or even that words existed. I was simply making my fingers go in monkey-like imitation. And in fact, she was very quick to pick up these signs. Once she learned doll, she could spell it, and book, and cake, and mug, and milk, and so on. And Anne Sullivan would always try to communicate to her at the same time what the corresponding object or action was that she was spelling into her hand. The child didn't get it. She confused them. She thought it was a wonderful game. She even tried to teach her dog to spell. She picked up the paw of her dog and started spelling into the dog's paw, so she understood this was some form of communication. And she would also be inquisitive and point to things in order to indicate that she wanted to know what the funny little finger play was that corresponded to that. The breakthrough came one day in a very magnificent form as she was going down to the garden with Anne Sullivan. Now, Anne Sullivan had been trying to communicate to her the difference between these two words, mug and milk, by giving her a mug and milk, but she couldn't get it. And she writes, this is Anne Sullivan reporting on the event immediately thereafter. This morning, while she was washing, she wanted to know the name for water, she being Helen. When she wants to know the name for anything, she points to it and pats my hand. I spelled W-A-T-E-R and thought no more about it until after breakfast. Then it occurred to me that with the help of this new word, I might succeed in straightening out the mug-milk difficulty. We went out to the pump house, and I made Helen hold the mug under the spout while I pumped. As the cold water gushed forth, filling the mug, I spelled W-A-T-E-R into Helen's free hand. The word coming so close upon the sensation of cold water rushing over her hand seemed to startle her. She dropped the mug and stood as one transfixed. A new light came into her face. She spelled water several times. Then she dropped on the ground and asked for its name and pointed to the pump and the trellis, and suddenly turning around, she asked for my name. I spelled teacher. Just then the nurse came, bringing Helen's little sister into the pump house. And Helen spelled baby and pointed to the nurse. All the way back to the house, she was highly excited and learned the name of every object she touched, so that in a few hours she had added 30 new words to her vocabulary. Here are a few of them: door, open, shut, give, go, come, and a great many more. Now, Helen herself relates this incident and adds a very important detail, crucial detail. She says, prior to going to the garden, her teacher had tried to communicate to her the meaning of doll by spelling it and giving her 2 dolls. But Helen responded in frustration by smashing the new doll. Neither sorrow nor regret followed my passionate outburst, she wrote. I had not loved the doll. In the still dark world in which I lived, there was no strong sentiment or tenderness. Then at the water pump, she recalled, I stood still, my whole attention focused upon the motion of her fingers. Suddenly I felt a misty consciousness as of something forgotten, a thrill of returning thought, and somehow the mystery of language was revealed to me. I knew then that W-A-T-E-R meant that wonderful, cool something that was flowing over my hand. That living word awakened my soul, gave it light, hope, joy, set it free. I left the well house eager to learn. Everything had a name, and each name gave birth to a new thought. On entering the door, I remembered the doll I had broken and picked up the pieces. I tried vainly to put them together. Then my eyes filled with tears, for I realized what I had done. And for the first time, I felt repentance and sorry. So here you have, with this immense breakthrough, which every child has, the breakthrough, the first understanding of the first word, the birth as well of the consciousness of emotion. And in fact, Anne Sullivan adds in her letter that she wasn't able to mail it immediately after she wrote it that night, but the next morning she added a postscript. I didn't finish my letter last night in time to get it posted, so I shall add a line. Helen got up this morning like a radiant fairy. She has flitted from object to object, asking the name of everything and kissing me for very gladness. Last night when I got into bed, she stole into my arms of her own accord and kissed me for the first time. And I thought my heart would break, so full it was of joy. Now it's clear from the versions of this breakthrough that we have, which are versions that came, in the case of Anne Sullivan, immediately thereafter. So they're authentic and very genuine. It's very clear that the breakthrough came not because a word had been repeated 5,000 times, as might be the case in some of these direct method teaching methods. Have you ever seen this English as a foreign language developed by the British? This is a book. Is this a book? Yes, it is. Is it a chair? No, it isn't. Is it a desk? No, it isn't. Is it a microphone? No, it isn't. What is it? It's a book. Is it a book? Yes, it is. You don't teach language that way. And you can see in the case of Helen Keller, she didn't learn it because of repetition. She learned it because there was the activity of her mind. Because there is the capacity for language inherent in the human mind, which after all is what created human language. And that was sparked, among other things, through love. And that was what made the breakthrough. Now, as Humboldt points out, when she learned the first word, it was not just the first word that she was learning, but the entire language. He writes, "The comprehension of words is a thing entirely different from the understanding of unarticulated sounds," the sound book in and of itself, and involves much more than that, than the mere mutual evocation of the sound and the object indicated. The word can also be taken as an indivisible whole, just as even in writing, we recognize the meaning of a word group without yet being certain of its alphabetic composition. And it may be possible that the child's mind proceeds thus in the first beginnings of understanding. But just as not merely the animal's sensory capacity, but the human power of speech is excited, even in the child, so the word, too, is perceived as articulated. Furthermore, Humboldt says, what articulation adds to the mere evocation of its meaning is that it presents the word directly through its form as part of an infinite whole, a language. Thus, the single word implicitly contains the whole of the language. Now, what was Anne Sullivan's method in teaching Helen Keller not only words, but the power of speech? The method, very quickly, was the following. She would spell into her hand everything. She would try not just to spell words, but to do the same thing that a normal parent or adult would do with a child who is not deaf, dumb, and blind, that is to speak full sentences, and hope that the child would then assimilate the organization of the sentence as a whole. So she would say, yes, I could write hat and walk, and Helen would know that she should get her hat and we would go out for a walk. But instead of that, I would write, please fetch your hat, we'll go for a walk, so that over time she would learn the entire sentence. She learned words very rapidly. In the space of weeks, Helen's vocabulary grew, multiplied from 100 to 300, 400, 600 words. But they were not only words, they were entire sentences that she began to communicate. Now, as Humboldt points out, even in single words, it is by means of this that we are given the possibility of constructing, from the elements of the language, a really indeterminate number of other words according to specific feelings and rules, and thereby to establish among all words an affinity corresponding to the affinity of concepts. That is, the geometry of language, the articulation of sounds, lending meaning on the one hand, and the geometry of concepts. This would not be possible, Humboldt says, if the soul did not harbor a power of rendering this possibility actual. He says furthermore that the speech learning of children is not an assignment of words to be deposited in memory and re-babbled by rote through the lips, but a growth in linguistic capacity with age and practice. What is heard does more than merely convey information to itself. It readies the mind also to understand more easily what has not yet been heard. It makes clear what was long ago heard, but then only half understood, or not at all. In that a similarity to the new perception suddenly brings light to the power that has since become sharpened. And it enhances the urge and capacity to absorb from what is heard ever more and more swiftly into the memory. The advances thus accelerate in a constantly increasing ratio, since the growth of power and the acquisition of material mutually strengthen and enlarge each other. So the growth in the power of speech is not linear, but, as he says, exponential. Now, the other important points to emphasize in understanding the method that Anne Sullivan used is that she never tried to communicate anything for the sake of communicating it or for the sake of teaching anything. She refused to organize formal lessons for her charge. But she would always follow the course of the curiosity of the child and speak about those things which the child felt were important, interesting, exciting, thought-provoking. Otherwise, she would not talk about it. She refused conversation for the sake of conversation. And she would follow the questions of the child. As she says that she would, sorry. She said, Helen's inquisitiveness was so great during these years, the first years, that it would have interfered with her progress in the acquisition of language if the consideration of the questions which were constantly occurring to her had been deferred until the completion of a lesson. In all probability, she would have forgotten the question, and a good opportunity to explain something of real interest to her would have been lost. Therefore, it has always seemed best to me to teach anything whenever my pupil needed to know it, whether it had any bearing on the projected lesson or not. Her inquiries have often led us far away from the subject under immediate consideration. The other thing that she tried to do was to always provoke interest in the child for the outside world, for the real world, and to mediate to her concepts and knowledge about certain subjects through direct contact with these realities. For example, instead of giving her a geography lesson, she would take her down to Keller's Landing and they would build dams out of the mud. And that way she would teach her about rivers and lakes and so on. Or the history lesson would begin with a trip to Bunker Hill, and she would tell her about the Bunker Hill Monument. Or the biology lesson would consist of having tadpoles in a pool and feeling the tadpoles every day to see how they grew into frogs, and so on and so forth. And as Helen says in her autobiography, Anne Sullivan always tried not only to mediate to her these beautiful activities of nature, but to communicate to her the beauty in all things in nature. Communicate to her an idea of beauty, an idea to a child who could not see or hear. Finally, what was very important in the teaching method was that everything was a game. Anne Sullivan said the teacher has to be a child in order to be a teacher. Otherwise, nothing works. So when she taught the child to read, after the child had learned a certain amount of language, she did it with pieces of paper and raised letters. She taught her our Latin alphabet and then later Braille. C-A-T for cat. And this is to a child who cannot hear, see. So it's all a very abstract process. But she learned it, she mastered it right away, and did so because they were playing games. with the pieces of paper and the objects that they represented. There were games also in the words themselves. For example, she said Helen would respond in a very interesting way to metaphors and to figurative language. She said, for example, when Helen was told that Hungarians are born musicians, you know, everybody says it's like Italians are born actors. Hungarians are born musicians. Helen asked, do they sing when they are born? And then when her friend added, the friend who told her this, added that some of the pupils he had seen in Budapest had more than 100 tunes in their heads, she said, laughing, I think their heads must be very noisy. So Anne Sullivan explains, she sees the ridiculous quickly, and instead of being seriously troubled by metaphorical language, she is often amused by her own too literate conception of meaning. On the question of metaphor, too, this one perhaps last thing to read is an example of how Helen learned abstract concepts. I mean, if you can more or less understand how doll, cat, water, or whatever could be communicated in the ways that we've seen, how do you communicate a concept like love? How indeed? Helen writes about this in her autobiography. I remember the morning when that I first asked the meaning of the word love. This was before I knew many words. I had found a few early violets in the garden and brought them to my teacher. She tried to kiss me, but at that time I did not like to have anyone kiss me except my mother. Miss Sullivan put her arm gently round me and spelled into my hand, I love Helen. What is love? I asked. She drew me closer to her and said, it is here, pointing to my heart, whose beats I was conscious of for the first time. Her words puzzled me very much because I did not then understand anything unless I touched it. I smelled the violets in her hand and asked, half in words, half in signs, a question which meant, is love the sweetness of flowers? No, said my teacher. Again I thought, the warm sun was shining on us. Is this not love? I asked, pointing in the direction from which the heat came. Is this not love? It seemed to me that there could be nothing more beautiful than the sun, whose warmth makes all things grow. But Miss Sullivan shook her head, and I was greatly puzzled and disappointed. I thought it strange that my teacher could not show me love. A day or two afterwards, I was stringing beads of different sizes in symmetrical groups, 2 large beads, 3 small ones, and so on. I had made many mistakes, and Miss Sullivan had pointed them out again and again with gentle patience. Finally, I noticed a very obvious error in the sequence, and for an instant, I concentrated my attention on the lesson and tried to think how I should have arranged the beads. Miss Sullivan touched my forehead and spelled with decided emphasis, think, T-H-I-N-K. In a flash, I knew that the word was the name of the process that was going on in my head. That was my first conscious perception of an abstract idea. For a long time, I was not thinking of the beads in my lap, but trying to find a meaning for love. In the light of this new idea, the sun had been under a cloud all day, and there had been brief showers, but suddenly the sun broke forth in all its sudden splendor. Again, I asked my teacher, is this not love? Love is something like the clouds that were in the sky before the sun came out, she replied. Then, in simpler words than these, which at that time I could not have understood, she explained, you cannot touch the clouds, you know, but you feel the rain and know how glad the flowers and the thirsty earth are to have it after a hot day. You cannot touch love either, but you feel the sweetness that it pours into everything. Without love, you would not be happy or want to play. The beautiful truth burst upon my mind. I felt that there were invisible lines stretched between my spirit and the spirit of others. Now, just to conclude very rapidly, through this relationship, Anne Sullivan and Helen Keller, this young child was educated in the way in which every child should be educated, but very few have been, in this century, in this country. By the time she was an adolescent, she had mastered several languages, not only English. She wrote her autobiography at the age of 22, by the way, first book. But she had also mastered Greek. She had to take an entrance exam in Greek, in fact, to be admitted to that hall of learning known as Harvard University, Radcliffe College. They did everything possible to keep her out, but she passed with flying colors in Greek, Latin, geometry, and everything else she had to take as an exam to get in. She knew German, she knew French. Goethe and Schiller were her favorite poets in German. Shakespeare was her favorite in English. The Bible was a book that she read so much the Braille had been worn down and she had to get new copies. When she went to Radcliffe, she thought that she was going to enter the halls of learning. She went, by the way, with Anne Sullivan, who spelled into her hand in every lecture everything that the teacher would say, as well as the books that she would read and so on. She went to Harvard because she said, that's the best, so I want to go to the best, I'll go to the best, and got in. But then she found out, as she said, college is not the universal Athens I thought it was. There one does not meet the great and wise face to face. One does even feel their living touch. They are there, it is true, but they seem mummified. And what she was referring to is the professors, particularly those who taught her literature, English literature. What she was taught in these literature courses was to go through and to define and analyze and dissect. And she says quite openly, many scholars forget, it seems to me, that our enjoyment of the great works of literature depends more upon the depth of our sympathy than upon our understanding. She means understanding in a formal sense. And further, she says, when I read I would never read in order to analyze the style. I didn't know what style was. I didn't study or analyze them. I didn't know what style they were written in, whether they were well written or not, these books. I never thought about the style or authorship. The books, they laid treasures at my feet, and I accepted them as we accept the sunshine and the love of our friends. She said, professors didn't understand. Great poetry, whether written in Greek or in English, needs no other interpreter than a responsive heart. It is not necessary that one should be able to define every word. And she had particularly pungent things to say about examinations, which she abhorred. Despite Radcliffe, despite Harvard, despite the literary critics and literature courses, Helen Keller managed to go through that university, and in the course of it, to assimilate the great works of literature, the great works of philosophy, religion, history, geography, universal history, to the extent that the books were available for her to read. And she came out, continuing her own self-development independently thereafter, to become, I think, probably the best educated and the most moral American woman of this century. Her ability of language was astounding, but as her teachers and friends pointed out, it was not a language ability, it was her ability to think, and it was her ability to use her mind. She did not only read and assimilate ideas, but she also wrote as soon as she could. She loved to write because it was a wonderful form of communication. She wrote her autobiography. She wrote a biography of her teacher. She wrote a diary after her teacher died. She wrote endless numbers of essays, pamphlets, encouraging children who were blind, deaf, and or dumb to fight through and to acquire the power of language. She campaigned worldwide for the rights of the handicapped, particularly of blind children, to have education. She visited the soldiers on the front, in the hospitals in World War II, particularly those who had been blinded, in order to encourage them not to give up hope, to take inspiration from her example. Could I have the last two transparencies, please? She was excited about everything that happened. This is her as a child reading. She would read with Braille with her left hand, and in the right hand she would spell it out for herself. Here she is reading French literature. The next, here she is as an older woman, as you see, with a typewriter as well as a Braille machine, where she composed. She was passionately involved in the great issues of the day. She was excited about every new invention that came out and wanted to meet the inventors of the telephone, for example. She traveled as much as she could. She was curious about new cultures, new lands, about art, sculpture. She even tried to learn music. Now, if you think about what Lynn has said about the way in which one should consider one's life, he said, think of one's life as one might think of a classical work of poetry or music. Our efficient individual existence is a metaphor in the form of the good. But I think this is definitely the case of Helen Keller. Her life is a metaphor. Helen Keller is one of the few Americans of this century who really touched Dante's Imperium. Late in life, she was asked by a journalist. Unfortunately, she also had to communicate with journalists. She was asked by a somewhat impertinent journalist, I might add, if she thought she had really achieved anything in her life. Her immediate reply was, I believe that all through these dark and silent years, God has been using my life for a purpose I do not know. But one day I shall understand, and then I will be satisfied. Thank you. To revive it. Now, I want to take the example of Dante to show exactly what goes into, or to show some aspects of what goes into developing a literate language. First of all, who was Dante Alighieri? He was a man who, at the end of the 13th century, a political figure, literary figure, somebody who had assimilated universal history up to that point, realized that the civilization that he lived in was doomed. He realized, and he was right, only a half a century later, Europe was to go into the greatest collapse that it had experienced up until that time, with the collapse of the banking system through the Venetian banks and the collapse of civilization, which led to the spread of deadly diseases, epidemics, the Black Plague, which wiped out half of the population of Europe. Dante knew, although he could not foresee the form in which this collapse would come, he knew that the collapse was coming because he saw the corruption, the rottenness, the betrayal, the treachery, the stupidity, the ignorance of the population around him and of the leadership of political institutions. What did Dante do? He was exiled, naturally. He was an oddball who therefore was completely excluded, ostracized from polite society. What could he do? He couldn't intervene politically. He called himself the party of one, il partito di uno, because he was alone. What he decided to do was to write a poem which would establish a national language and develop certain very fundamental, very important ideas, which would then lay the seeds for the future regeneration of a culture in a country whose civilization he saw was doomed. What his aim was in writing this great work, the Commedia, and developing the linguistic, poetical means to do it, his aim was to change the way in which people thought, to change the axioms of the Italians, and to create the basis for a national identity by creating a true national language. Now, Dante elaborated a general theory of the language and of poetry, which was to become the foundation not only for the Italian language, but by extension for all national languages. In his work, De Volgari Eloquentia, which is on the eloquence of the vernacular, the mother tongue, Dante surveyed the Italian landscape at the time, and which was made up of thousands of petty fiefdoms, thousands of little groups of nobles who were jealously guarding their particular turf, their particular power. There were about 30,000 different dialects of what you could call Italian. Not only did every city have its dialect, but as Dante points out, the Bolognese, the people of Bologna, of one neighborhood, Borgo di San Felice, spoke a slightly different dialect than the Bolognese who lived on the main street in the city, and they were proud of it. Not only were these many, but most of them were very ugly. In judging each dialect, which Dante knew intimately, he used musical criteria in order to see which were better and which were worse. He sought out the most harmonious. He said first, since the Romans, the inhabitants of the city of Rome, consider themselves first in everything, we will consider them first in execration, the language, and say that the vernacular spoken by the Romans, or better, their sad language, questo triste parlare, is the ugliest of all the vernaculars. Of course, Dante had not been to the Bronx, he had not been to Dallas, Texas, so that was his frame of reference. But he adds, no wonder the Romans speak such an ugly language, since their habits and their customs stink. The Milanese, the Bergamaschi, he discards as grating to the ear. The Sardinians do not even merit to be considered as a dialect, because what they speak, he says, is no proper vernacular. It's rather a bastardized imitation of Latin, which is an artificial language, Dante knew. The Genoese, he said, would be totally mute if one were to force them not to use the sound z, because they put it in every word. Having gone through the gamut of these dialects, Dante asks himself, just as all numbers numerically, just as all numbers, multiplicity, must be measured in reference to unity, the one, there must be a vernacular which appears in every city but lives, rests in no single one. In other words, he was asking himself the question, what is the one which corresponds to the many of these dialects? The one did not exist in its manifest form, so Dante had to create it, applying the harmonic criteria of music. Thus he identified the 5 pure vowel sounds, primary in the Italian language, actually in all languages. A, E, I, O, U. As opposed to, for example, the U from the Turinese dialect, la luna, they say, instead of luna. Or the Milanese say Milanese, instead of Milanese. And then he considered the beauty of the words according to the purity of their sound. Can we have the first transparency, please? The most beautiful words, which Dante calls combed with a comb, not disheveled, are those of 3 syllables, the ones on the bottom, without harsh sounds, without double consonants. Words like amore, donna, disio, virtute, donare, letizia, salute, securitate, difesa. These are words that are not only correspond to the formal criteria, but also, from the standpoint of their content, are noble words. We're talking here about love, woman, desire, virtue, giving, happiness, health, security, defense. Concepts that are proper to the moral persons and a moral ordering of society. Ideas that Lynn introduced yesterday. One of the main reasons why the American population seems to be in the state it is today is that it seems to have lost the capacity to debate real issues in a literate way. If you were to ask, and Lynn addressed this yesterday with the question of Hamlet, if you were to ask the average American, present company excluded of course, what the great drama of the day is, that average American might be bewildered and say, well, since the O.J. Simpson trial has gone, there's not very much drama around. But we have high hopes that something might come up in the grand jury with Hillary. The American population and this is a tragedy, has lost its capacity to to thrash out ideas in the form in which literate language makes it possible. Now, this was not always so. As we will see in the presentations in the panel in the afternoon, I'm sure, discussing the real background of the American Revolution and the building of the Republic, we will see that those people who founded this republic were not a bunch of illiterate backwoodsmen who came here to develop the frontier. These were philosophers who built this nation. These were literate people. The population of the early colonies and of the early republic was indeed the most literate in the world of the day. If you read the works of Tom Paine, one of the compatriots of the revolution and the constitutional process here, and you see his account of how the Constitution was discussed in this country, it's absolutely mind-boggling, because he describes how, from the Constitutional Convention, ideas, drafts, proposals for the Constitution would be sent out into the population, into the different states, discussed, debated in town meetings, in homes, in farms. Ideas would be added, contributed, criticism would be made, and this process would go back into the central discussion in Philadelphia and elsewhere. This was a population which had been raised on those great works of literature in the English language. This was a population that had been brought up on Shakespeare, on Marlowe, a profoundly religious Christian population whose mind was imbued with the ideas and the language of the great King James Version of the Bible. What that population had, and which the population today has lost, but not irrevocably, was what Dante Alighieri would call a volgare illustre, an illustrious vernacular. That is, the native tongue, the vernacular, the mother tongue of a people, elevated through great poetry, great drama, great literature, to become a vehicle for communicating what Shelley would call impassioned ideas concerning man and the universe. America indeed has lost this and is part of our commitment. Other things, it has no angles. So the more successful you are, the closer you come, the farther away you are, which proves that the circle is of an other and superior characteristic regarding as compared to the polygon. Now, having gone through this, thank you, you can put a name to this and call it squaring the circle, or the attempted proof of squaring the circle. In other words, a metaphor is a name that you give to a discovery, a scientific discovery, which after having gone through the process of replicating that discovery or making it originally for the first time, a name is attached to, and that name then becomes a referent for the process we have just gone through. This is what poetry does. Now, Dante saw, next please, in the form of the strophic poem, the key to all composition. And he called it the canzone. Canzone from the verb cantare, to sing. Canzone is song. As Lynn has written, the tradition of vocalization of classical strophic poetry is the probable origin of what we know as scientific thought and scientific method today. This is something that Dante understood, intuited. He understood that strophic poetry held the key to the transmission of certain specific ideas, scientific ideas. Now, how he talks about the canzone is in the following terms. What is the canzone, he says? Well, it's the action or passion of singing, the action of him who creates it, the composer, and the passion on the part of him who recites or sings it. The canzone, furthermore, is very different from and superior to other poetical forms, like the ballad or the sonnet, because the canzone is made up of harmonized words, harmonically composed and combined words, which are apt to be sung. In other words, it has the musicality in itself and requires no musical accompaniment, as did the ballad and the sonnet. Now, what is the form of the canzone? He says it's a conjugation, like you'd usually use to describe a verb, a conjugation of stanzas which tend toward a statement, a single idea, a concept. The key in the canzone is the stanza, which he calls the heart of the canzone. The art, all of the art of the canzone is contained in the stanza. Now, what is the stanza? Stanza, by the way, means room. Like this is a room, a large, this is stanzone, big room. But stanza means a room. The stanza is formally a number of poetical lines which may be divided according to length of syllables, for example, 11 syllables, 7 syllables, 9 syllables, and so on, and organized in groups. For example, this is a schematic rendering of what Dante calls a typical stanza. You would have 4 lines at the beginning, say all 11 syllables, rhyming society. Other kinds of words, which Dante called hirsute, hairy, are monosyllabic words, but necessary. And he also had a category of decorative words, ornate words, of many, many syllables, including very harsh sounds and double consonants. Some of them you see above. Terra, terra. Honore, the H was aspirated. Speranza, gravitate, alleviato, impossibilitate, benaventuratissimo, avventuratissimamente, disavventuratissimamente, sovramagnificentissimamente. Which last word, Dante points out, is a word of 11 syllables, a hendecasyllable. And that, he says, is the maximum length for a word in the Italian language. For reasons you can appreciate after hearing me struggle to say it. But we'll get to the real reason why. Dante did not take all of these words and make rules and compile a dictionary, as, for example, Dr. Samuel Johnson in 18th century England would have done or did do. It was not the formal question of communication. It was not the formal question of conjugation, syntax, or rules. But it was the question of shaping a medium capable of communicating creative scientific ideas. Dante forged this vehicle on the basis of the harmonic criteria, which we will see, in order to create the language of science, which is called poetry. He elaborated the science of composition of poetry, and therefore music, which derives from poetry, not only for the Italian language, but implicitly for all languages. Now, Dante understood that the vehicle for communicating a creative idea is a metaphor. Next transparency, please. What do we mean by a metaphor? Using an example which Lynn has developed and used many times, look at this little drawing. You see that what we have here is a circle in the top left with an inscribed and actually circumscribed square. The square, the polygon inside as well as outside in this case, but inside the circle is continually divided up so that each side is divided, the number of sides becomes multiplied. The idea behind this process is to try to bring the polygon into coherence with the circle, to square the circle. As you see, however, the more successful we are in this process, actually the farther away from our aim we come. In the microscopic view that you have in the lower right, you'll see that what happens in continuing this process of multiplication to come closer asymptotically to the circle, what happens is that you are multiplying the number of singularities, the number of angles, which is the characteristic of the polygon. Whereas the circle is characterized by the fact, among